Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Thrive Co-Living Communities YouTube podcast. I'm Mark Stein, Thrive founder and your podcast host. We're creating sustainable, inclusive, and multi-generational residential communities from repurposed big box stores or other unused buildings. By offering unique and ecological co-living options, our aim is to combat the epidemic of isolation, revitalize communities, and help others discover the many benefits of engaged community living. In this podcast series, join us as we discuss co-living and other aspects of our concept, in addition to bringing you interesting people who are doing cool things from around the world. Through this podcast, learn more about our concept and see how Thrive co-living communities will bring together people from all walks of life. To find more about us, visit www.thrivecolivingcommunities.org. Thanks for watching and enjoy the podcast. So hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Thrive Co-Living Communities YouTube podcast. Glad to have you back. And today I have as guest Cara Silletto. She is a consultant with Magnet Culture, and she'll tell you more about what she does. And then Jess Magniccari, who is going to join me in asking questions and just participating in the discussion about multi-generations working together and living together. So that's our topic today. And really, I think can be helpful for you if you're in business and working with multiple generations within your workplace. But our focus mainly is interest in how these generations will live and cooperate in a Thrive community and how best to get that working smoothly. So both of you, thank you for being here, and let's jump in. Cara, maybe you could start with just giving us an overview of your consultancy and what you focus on, and then kick us off into some content about multi-generational workplace and extrapolate.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So what a huge topic. Do we have 3 days, Mark? Or
we
no?
do.
Okay.
I hope
All right.
We blocked it off and had meals.
Yes. Awesome. So yeah, my name is Cara Silletto. I'm the president and chief retention officer at Magnet Culture. We are an organization that has been focused for almost a decade on bridging generational gaps within the workplace, as well as now reducing employee turnover and everything associated with why people stay and why people go. So as Mark and I have talked recently and over the years, it is such a huge part of relationships and a huge part of retention, whether you're talking about a workplace or the co-living concepts and those environments as well, that people were raised differently. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The research shows that people who were raised in a similar time in a similar place, as far as a region of the country or a country in the world, that they tend to have similar outlooks and foundational similarities in their perspective and their priorities in life. Now, it doesn't mean that we're all the same. So, just back off. We absolutely, can't put everybody into buckets. One of the things that I preach is that it is not about your birth year. It's about your mindset. And so I happen to be one of the oldest millennials, born in 1981. And yet I have met a lot of people that are older than me who have a very millennial mindset. And I've met folks that are younger than me that are what we call old souls. So there are a lot of folks that don't fall into the traditional bucket of the generalizations or even stereotypes that we put on those generational groups. And yet I would say I'm pretty millennial through and through. Heightened sense of entitlement, very little loyalty. I love change and get bored easily. And I'm an entrepreneur type as well, always looking for the next opportunity and those types of things. And so, yeah, I've been spending all my time talking about those particular things. And Jess, I hear you're a millennial too.
I am. I love hearing what you're saying, actually, because when you bring up the different traits, it actually is making it sound like this can be a little bit more fun to think about, almost like what personality type are you, or what this or that. And I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of, because at first you're, of course you're like, which one am I and whatever, but I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of fun to mix and match, and maybe who you fit with or whatever, or how everyone can fit together. I think it's really interesting mindsets and what generation you are, what we think about. I've noticed, as a millennial, I feel like I'm an old soul / millennial, but I feel like we're very aware, self-aware. I could be wrong, but mental health seems like a big thing. Even, just jogging through my own experiences, comparing, I think of, oh, that generation never even thought about these things. Kind of we do. I also think about job interviews, when I've interviewed people that I know are much younger than me, and the things they bring up on interviews that I'm like, oh, wow, I would have never brought that up when I was interviewing for a job. So I'm like, it's interesting. Like, people are talking about different things. There's different priorities. So yeah, just it's very interesting stuff, interesting topics to reflect on.
I feel like in many cases, the pendulum just always swings kind of back and forth, right? And so they always say, like, hold on to your clothes because they'll come back in style 30 or 40 years later. And what's happening right now, Jess? Bell bottoms are coming back. And I remember that in the 90s, that the 60s and 70s fashion was coming back around in the late 90s. And I had bell bottoms in high school. And then, of course, they're long gone. And now the bigger, the better. They're all of that is swinging back around, right?
Yeah, so true. I had the bell bottoms too. And now I love the straight legs, but I'm not going back to bell bottoms.
Have you noticed, though, that the styles don't totally come back? If it's a wide tie, it's not striped, it's something else. It never comes back exactly, so that the vintage shops can't totally cash in. So
yeah, it's so interesting because you're right. We put like a modern flair to it, or sometimes we will combine the best of two different generations, right? And so fashion's just an easy one because we still have some of that stuff in our closets, or we all remember wearing those things. But you're exactly right. Even when this 80s culture came back this last 10 years, where like hot pink and neon came back for a little while. Luckily, it didn't last long, but that came back, and it was with new shapes, right? And things. It wasn't necessarily the off the shoulder flash dance sweatshirt type of stuff. Although I saw a little bit of that, but yeah, they take the modern twist to those things. And so I think with even the workplace and co-living environments, for example, we can see that things kind of swing one way and then swing another. We saw a huge influx to suburbia, right? For a generation or two. And then you've got now more millennials are wanting to be kid free, and they want to live right downtown in the middle of it all, and things like that. So for every one of those trends, it's like we swing back and forth. And we talk a lot in our generational work about the different spectrum of perspective. Kind of, if you see two sides of a coin, although it's more complex than just two sides. But if you think about any generational conflict or any issue that you would say, oh, millennials are like this, and millennials would say, oh, the boomers are like this. If you take that perspective, almost any one of them has a traditional end and a more millennial or progressive end of the other side of it. And I would argue there's no right or wrong in those conversations. It's just, how were you raised? And can you understand? Can you be open-minded enough to see where the other people are coming from? Mm-hmm. Because if you have to live or work with people who think differently than you do, you better listen. And you better have your ears open and try to understand the backstory of where people are coming from. So I'm curious, Jess, when you say you're kind of a mix of the old soul and the millennial, right? What's something about you that you would say is more traditional minded that you're kind of maybe even a little old school about it? What's something that comes to mind?
So, and as you were talking, like, it's funny because my first thoughts when, on all this, I was thinking more of emotional things and just how we act. Then my mind went to technology, which is such another aspect of how different generations deal and what they look at.
Yeah.
Where I truly feel more of an old soul, like in the day-to-day work interactions, let's say. And again, this might sound bad, but like, I'm so detail oriented. I'm very, for instance, I'll read every page of a contract. I feel like that's a little bit more of a older traditional thing, although I don't, maybe there's people that never read the contracts, but I do a lot of contract stuff. That's just an example of, I really check all my boxes, and sometimes I feel like my fellow millennials are just like, what
Next.
Contract?
Yeah.
So something like that comes to mind. I'm also old fashioned when it comes to things like social media. I'm always like, now we're doing videos. Like, do we need like weren't the regular images fine? Like now, we're always animating and adding and making it pop out more. And I feel like I think we're going in the direction of overload. That's just my personal sense. But then, when you're in a group, especially at work, and working in the field of marketing and design, it's talk about seeing the other side of things. You really have to see what's working. Why are we doing this? Yeah. But I tend to be more of a minimal, like, we don't need all that, we don't need to go to the next thing. So
gotcha. There's an age-old saying out there of anything new after you're 35 is unnecessary.
I love it.
It's like, once you're 35, like any new music, that's not music, that's noise, right? Like music, let me tell you about music. And of course, my dad would refer to the Beatles and I would refer to Beyonce. Like, let me tell you what real music sounds like, that type of stuff. And I'm talking early Beyonce, not even current Beyonce. But yeah, it's that idea that we kind of take in. It's amazing, as young people, we take in new stuff all the time. And then there are only certain people who continue to accept and embrace and seek out new things, versus once you've lived to that like 35 to 40-year-old mark, then it's like you kind of settle into your groove and like, okay, this is the kind of music I like. This is the kind of food I like to eat. This is the area of town I want to live in. These are the types of movies I like, all of that type of stuff. So that's interesting that you said that. But, some of the things that you just mentioned are more personality than they are generational, right? Because if you think about the backstory and you think about the way that we're wired, your example about reading the contract, yes, I would say a generational difference is that more millennials are like in a hurry and just less tolerant of the tedium, of that type of thing. So it's like, okay, come on, just because they're impatient. And if you think about it, think about how much when we were growing up, did we have to wait for? I'm the microwave generation. I didn't even have to wait 20 minutes for dinner. I waited 3 minutes and my mac and cheese bowl was ready. Ding, So we tend to be, the younger that folks are, the less experience we have at practicing patience. Seriously, that sounds like immature and just, young and dumb. But seriously, we haven't had to wait for very much. And you think about credit cards. In the 1980s, credit cards became mainstream for middle-class families. So previous to our upbringing, Jess, you had people that had to, what'd they call it? Save up. Is that right, Mark? Is that what it's called?
That's a weird concept.
Yeah, people had to save up for things. And ever since I've been 18, I had a credit card. It was like, save up for what? No way. I'm getting it now and I'll pay it off later.
And not only that, but we put it on layaway.
Oh, yes.
So it went up on a shelf and we paid $5 a month
little bit.
And then it came off the shelf at Christmas time when we paid it off. Hey, Cara, before we get too far, why don't you characterize each of the generations that are in the workplace now?
Oh, yeah.
And will be at Thrive. Sort of give us a snapshot of each of the generations, realizing we're stereotyping. No, just the disclaimer you said, but I think it would be helpful for this conversation to have some benchmarks.
Yeah. So there's no governing agency, just a heads up, that defines the generations. Okay. But there are tons of researchers out there and research institutions who have to put a cutoff date on their dates, their birth dates, in order to do the research. So I just follow Pew Research mostly and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because from a demographic standpoint in the US, they're going to have cutoffs to do all their data collection for census and everything else, right? So we have the traditionalists who were born pre-1945, all right? Very teeny tiny percent of the workforce at this point, 1%, if even that much, depending on your region. And so most of that group has retired. And then the baby boomers still hold the majority of the senior leadership positions within the workforce side. Now, previous to COVID, we had been seeing about 6,000 boomers a day retiring, even though this is interesting from the living standpoint. 10,000 baby boomers a day turn 65, but only 6,000 a day are retiring because people are working longer, right? And you're seeing people, my dad worked till 72, things like that. So they're delaying that retirement and that phase of life, right? So the baby boomers, pretty much everybody agrees that is folks born from 46 to 64, all right? And then we have Gen X, which was a much smaller cohort. Instead of being 80 million strong like the boomers, Gen X was about 60 million strong. And that group was born, of course, starting in 1965. Most researchers cut it off right around 1980 is the cutoff for that. So there's also what we call cuspers. If you're within 2 years on either side of the cusp, then you often are going to see both traits, right, of those different generations and your upbringing. So according to Pew and the research from Bureau of Labor Statistics, then the millennial group, also called Generation Y, that's the same thing. The millennials were born between 81 and 96. And now the reason that they recently cut it off at 96, once the millennials were kind of raised up into their 20s and we figured out what the good cutoff is, it's because anybody born after 1996 doesn't remember 9/11. And that is such a huge societal game changer for our culture, that's where they drew that line. So now we've got Gen Z, who is the after 1996, the post 9/11 kids that only know a world where you take your shoes off before you get on an airplane, right? They never knew the world before that. And we really don't know when Gen Z is going to get cut off. Some of the researchers are speculating that right now. I think it's going to be 2013, 14, 15, because I think they will end up cutting it off because the children under that age won't remember the pandemic. So I think the pandemic is going to be the next breaker, right? And if you had your kid after 2015, they will have been too young to understand the masks and school was shut down for a year and they won't even know or remember that. Where my son, who was born in 2014, he's now 7. He very clearly will forever remember that his kindergarten year got shut down, and that his first grade, he's wearing a mask still, right? So he's going to have that memory forever. So I think he'll be the tail end of Gen Z for sure. So yeah, we've got, a good 5 generations, and we're probably birthing the 6th, the 6th generation right now that will end up being in co-living spaces together and working down the road. Yeah.
So you've mainly defined the boundaries between them. Mm-hmm. can you now go back and sort of characterize each one and
Sure.
and describe each group, realizing we're generalizing?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I will say that traditionalists, that generation was more of a punch clock generation. That was my grandfather's group, and most of the women then did not work. So the men would go to work, they punch in, punch out, and be home by about 5 o'clock, 4:35, 5:30 for the hot meal that was waiting on the table for them, and that type of thing. So a very traditional sense of that family dynamic. Then the baby boomers came in, and again, it was primarily men who were working still. Some of the boomer women went to work, but many of them stayed at home at first to raise their kids. Then they went to work a little bit later. But the baby boomer men said, wait a minute, if I work harder, I can have more. So a lot of those boomer men started to create new businesses, create career paths for themselves to grow their career and climb the ladder and things like that. Some of them became true workaholics. Now, that was my father. He worked nights, he worked weekends, he had his own business, and it was all self-imposed. But they tended to do that. It wasn't necessarily a greed factor. It was more, I want a better life for my kids. Right. So many of them, like my dad, he was the youngest of 9. So he never had anything as a kid. I mean, it was all hand-me-downs and shared rooms and everything. And so he worked really hard to get us to middle class in a nice, safe, suburban neighborhood with good schools, and that we could go on vacations here and there, right? That was a big goal for him because he never got to go on vacations. Then Gen X, because, I mentioned they were a lot smaller than the baby boomer group. When Gen X came into the work world, for example, more than half of the women went straight into the work world, which was a big threshold that we crossed that 50% women working mark. Also, more than 50% of the Gen Xers went to school right out of high school, went to college. So we had a more formally educated group then. And then the Gen Xers, we certainly have, again, there's outliers here. We certainly have some who were more free spirit and I want to build my own career and, all of this stuff. But a lot of the Gen Xers took on the expectations of the boomers who were now workaholics leading these companies. You stay till the job gets done and, you don't talk back to your boss and you wear what I want you to wear because the entire policy says so, right? I don't know any ladies, I've yet to meet any ladies who wanted to wear pantyhose ever. Okay. So yeah, the Gen Xers, many of them, like I kind of explained, they fell in line and did what the boomers wanted them to, not 100%, but as far as work expectations and things, they did that. And then they became somewhat of workaholics, right? So we talk about that pendulum swinging and now what happened? Do, 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 do. And the millennials go, I'm not doing it. And so right now we're seeing the Great Resignation, which I prefer right now to call it the Great Reset. Because I think that we pushed and pushed and pushed all of our workers, the boomers, the Gen Xers, the older millennials, we pushed them to do more with less, do more with less. And now you're seeing the workforce, millennials and Gen Z are kind of leading the pack on this one of saying enough is enough. And I don't want to miss my kids' games like my father did, right? My dad was always at work. He wasn't at my games. So now those grandfathers, it's kind of funny to see those grandparents make up for lost time. And now they're at every game. They're spoiling their grandkids. They're taking them out for ice cream, and then they're telling the moms and dads, don't be a workaholic. It's not worth it. Go follow your passion and do what you love and be there for your kids, So there's a lot of that now that has pushed back, which makes the millennial group look entitled and selfish and lazy and all those things that they have always labeled young people as. And so now the millennials are kind of changing what is expected. And Jess earlier brought up the mental health conversation. I think that's going to be one of Gen Z's marks on the workforce is they are now absolutely expecting that you hire the whole me. I am a whole person. I am not just a 9 to 5 person. You're hiring me with my anxiety, with my 4-legged fur babies that are very, very important to me, with my political stance that is very important to me, my social issues that I donate to and I want to go volunteer for, very important to me. And as an employer, you better respect the whole me, which is very jarring. Like I love that. And it's kind of how I run my business. We're very personal, very connected to one another personally and professionally, but it's very jarring to the older, more traditional minded workers, and especially the bosses that are like, what? You leave that crap at home. You don't bring that discussion into work. It's not appropriate. It's not professional. And just leave that hat at the door. And I'm sorry that your dog died, but get over it and get your dang job done. Right? I don't know. Jess, what are you seeing? Any of that?
Yeah, no, I think it's tricky because I've seen, like I say, my experience interviewing people that I know are probably 10 years younger than me, and bringing up on the interview their anxiety and everything you said, basically in a nutshell has all been brought up on interviews. And I remember when I'm like, wow, like I never spoke about that stuff when I was interviewing. This is my first foot in the door moment, let alone day to day. And I've experienced it with coworkers too. And of course, like you said too, sometimes it's just a personality thing. Some people will share everything and others are, they keep to themselves, especially at work. But the shift is happening. Whether there's these little instances that you could say personality not or whatever, but overall, there's such a huge shift in workplace stuff.
Yep.
Work-life balance. Again, like these terms weren't even around for the big, like no one knew work-life balance. I also think, when you were describing the different generations, like starting from, I was relating with my experience too, where my dad started his own multiple businesses and worked really, really hard, and he lived for that. And it was like the American dream, and that's what people did. I question now, sometimes because I sit and I look at our generation and I'm like, sometimes I think if you kill yourself and work that hard today, so I don't see putting in the work and the return necessarily being the same as it used to be. And there's so many factors in that. So many things have changed. Education has changed tremendously. To me, technology just altered everything as far as skills, training, and just the landscape has totally changed, and workplaces have changed. So there's just so many factors involved in this.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I question, generationally, does the work output doesn't seem to bring the same results. There's so many reasons for that.
Yes. And it can go either way. You can either put in a ton of work and it pays off big time, or you can put in a ton of work and, pardon me, get screwed. You know what I mean? Because we saw like the mass layoffs. And in case you didn't know, the Bureau of Labor Statistics started tracking mass layoffs in 1995. Because mass layoffs just weren't much of a thing back then, but before that time period. So now, my mom got laid off multiple times during my childhood just because the company was outsourcing or centralizing all the accounting offices to Green Bay or whatever. Exactly. You know what I mean? She didn't do anything wrong. Her entire department would be displaced. And my sister has been laid off multiple times. So there's just no guarantees that the hard work is going to pay off necessarily.
Yeah, it seems like over the years, competition has changed as far as now we can hire overseas, where there's a greater population. Like maybe part of we grew and grew and grew, things changed and changed and changed. And like now it comes around to this whole new framework of what's in, I guess the younger generations have come around and said, what's important to us now in this landscape. And
Yes.
it's interesting. It's like there's a reaction to everything going on. So this is the reaction.
Yeah. And you mentioned the technology piece has changed the game. So think about the success trajectory for baby boomers. Okay. It was hard work. It was long time. It was overtime. And, then it may have gotten easier and easier as they got older, because then they had better connections and more knowledge. And, so it kind of looked like that. It was like not much growth at first. And then, okay, now I have great, tremendous success toward the end of my career. Well, the millennials, I absolutely hate to use this example, but it really is a generational difference that happened overnight, was when Mark Zuckerberg became a billionaire at age 26, I think, and he was wearing a hoodie. So then all of a sudden people are going, wait a minute, I don't have to wait until I'm 40 or 50 to be a millionaire. I don't have to go to college or finish college to be successful. Wait a minute, I can do my own thing, or I can use technology, right? There were all these tech companies and tech startups that happened, and people were selling them for millions of dollars, even without a college degree. And then you had folks who went to college. Don't even get me started on student debt, right? But they come out with more student debt than they were even making at their first job salary. And then it takes years. I was actually just talking to a friend that is almost 40 and still not even close to paying off her student debt from 20 years ago. Still lingering over her. And so in her mind, she's not successful because, she makes decent money now, but she's still got all this debt and not as much to show for it, to show for her success as she would like to have.
Right. Yeah. It's like so much to think about. I think, and sometimes, it's like, again, thinking about your career and where you are in the workplace or where you've been, like you say, now there are these grandparents that are sitting back and relaxing. So it's like everyone's in a different position in this. Yeah. And even in the same workplace, there's the people who have been there for 20 years and are getting ready to retire, new people coming in. And personally, sometimes it's tough. Like I'll be like, oh, I wish I did this, or I wish I knew that. And for millennials, like when we were growing up as kids, technology was out of the picture. So some of the careers that are the best careers to have today didn't even exist when we were little kids saying, I want to be an astronaut. There was no, like, I want to be a
social media manager.
Exactly. There was no social media. So, sometimes personally, I'll be like, oh man, I should have done this or that, or forget college. I should have just done YouTube, which is what I do now. I just go on YouTube and learn everything. But on the same note, when you step back and look at the big picture, it's like, well, it's just one big, very interesting mix of what's gone on. And just like you say, even defining the generations, these different historical things that are defined. I didn't even know that it was 9/11 and now it's going to be the pandemic. I said, technology has always been a huge one for me, that I just, like when I'm with my mom and I'm like, why is she doing it that way and I'm doing it this way? Or why am I frustrated? I'm always like, it's because of technology, whatever it may be, work, dating. It's so different. The way we do things, it's so crazy.
Well, think about the access. That's like a big word that I've been talking about lately, because you can say technology in general, and technology has given us the access. But I remember at my first job, I got a communications undergrad degree. So I didn't really understand the business side of things. And I remember the CFO at our company, we were a small company, so I could talk to everybody, and the CFO, she was talking to me one day and just using some language about financial statements that I didn't understand. And I said, what's the difference between a balance sheet and an income statement? Because I would even look at the statements and I still was like, why do we have two different statements? I don't really understand what these are. And so she took me under her wing and she taught me about, gross profit and net profit and expenses and income, and, and the snapshot of the balance sheet versus the P&L. And like, she taught me all of that stuff. And I just think today, if I had been 24 years old again and wondered that, I wouldn't even have to find a mentor, because I had to go find somebody willing to sit with me and talk to me and teach me. And now you just YouTube it. Right. You can YouTube the answer to any of that stuff. So sometimes people get frustrated that the younger workers want to advance faster. And even I could even see a young person wanting to learn how to garden. Right. And instead of having to find somebody, a mentor, to teach them and show them the way and read books about it and everything. No, now you just follow a couple blogs, Google that, and you can just learn a lot faster. Yeah. The learning curve is much, much faster because of the access to the information and the mentorship and the training and resources and all of that stuff. I mean, it's just unbelievable what's at our fingertips today that we didn't have even 10 years ago, especially 20, 30 years ago. It's amazing.
For sure.
Cara, when I think about the multiple generations living under the same roof, literally, although they'll each have their own place, I mostly think about boomers relating to millennials and some of the rubs that we have as generations. And I've got a couple thoughts about this, but one is, how much of that rub do you think is millennial kids seeing boomers as their parents and boomers taking a parental role, and how will that play out, do you think, in co-living?
Once I hit about age 35, some of my best friends now are 50, 60. There can absolutely be a tremendous connection between people. I think more of it is about what stage you are in life, right? So like parents of young kids tend to flock to parents of young kids. Whether you were a late mom and you're 40 with a young kid, or you're an early mom, 25, like you may hang out because you're in that same stage of life. So I think it's more so about what stage of life people are in versus the actual ages. And I'm going to guess, I do think, Mark, that the people drawn to a co-living environment are going to be more progressive thinkers, right? More community-minded thinkers, not as much traditional thinkers. I think it's going to be more folks who are a millennial mindset trapped in a boomer body. Okay. I think that's who you'll be more attracted to. And then that means that those millennials and those young-minded boomers are very likely to get along. There is certainly going to be different behavioral types. Like when she was saying earlier about I read the contract, that's because she is more detail oriented and more analytical in the way that she's wired. That's not necessarily a generational difference, but you will definitely see behavioral conflict at different types. You will see people that are more, you'll have more introvert versus extrovert of, okay, what time are quiet hours? And things like that. You will absolutely see people that are more open book. I'll tell you anything, ask me anything. And I just tell you about my recent doctor's appointment and everything they told me is wrong with my inner parts. And I mean, you'll just have the open book kind of person. And then other people saying, I didn't need to know that. Yeah. La, 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 la. Right. So yeah, I mean, you'll definitely have different styles, people that are, just everybody was raised so differently as well, of the way that you clean. Okay. We've all told someone to clean something, whether it was a roommate, a child, a friend, a spouse, you told someone to clean something and they cleaned it, but not the way you would have cleaned it. You know what I mean? They missed a spot. They did this, but they didn't do this. They do that kind of thing. And so I think back to what I was saying earlier about just listening to each other, hearing both sides of different examples and different stories and different perspectives and whatnot. I think there just has to be so much grace given to one another. I think there's going to need to be a lot of really direct communication. You can't get passive aggressive. You can't get really sugarcoaty. Well, if you wouldn't mind, like, it's like, hey, would you mind doing that? Not if it's not too much trouble. Would you mind if you don't mind? If it's okay, I would really prefer, but it's okay if you don't. Right? If we go that route where it's like super indirect, sugar coated, then that causes a lot more conflict. If you just have differences, just talking more directly and listening to one another about those things is gonna be much better in the long run.
But then bring in the Gen Zs into that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I can see them needing that pampering. Don't mess with my vibe. I am, and my feelings were hurt by you asking me to take out the trash.
Oh,
no matter
yeah.
how sweet it was. So then maybe that's what eventually unites baby boomers and millennials is Gen Zs, because I just read an article in the Times, and I'll have Libby put it in the show notes, but it was talking about millennials and Gen Zs, and how they are having conflict as millennial managers dealing with Gen Z.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Jess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, like that. It's funny, just from where I sit as an older millennial, I relate more to the baby boomers and generally older people, and I do have a lot of older friends, and then I'm like, yeah, these like younger people, which I guess is Gen Zs. I always get the names mixed up. I'm like, with the feelings, and I'm all about the feelings, but like my feelings were hurt or whatever. Like when it comes down to work, and I'm also a fairly direct person, but I really appreciate what you were saying about the don't be passive and like, but if this or that, because I loved how you were saying it. I was like, oh yeah, that's terrible. And I was like, oh yeah, sometimes I talk like that too. So, like going back and forth in my mind, but when it comes to like my feelings were hurt or this or that, that's where, and I was wondering when you were saying uniting the baby boomers and millennials, I was like, is it because we're both going to get annoyed with the Gen Z?
Yes. Yes, it is.
So there we go. And yeah, just general thoughts on co-living. Like, I feel like people, they're just the way I see people, like some people are going to want to stick to their own age group. I think when it comes to co-living or going on a group travel trip or anything like that, my thought is some people are going to look into things and think, they're going to pick a group that looks like their age or like them or whatever it may be. And other people, I think, go places and do things with a variety of age groups. I've always been something where the activities I generally do, like I'll go biking with a group and I find people of all ages, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. Yeah. And so I'm so used to that. And I feel like in a co-living situation, a lot of people would walk into it expecting that, but there are some people that might pick a different co-living versus the other. Just, sure. I think of it as when you're traveling, like you look at the group and you're like, oh, that looks like what I want or not,
Well, and you think about, there are a lot of senior living housing that is not even that you need any kind of care, but just this is a 55 and older community or a 65 and older community. And so, yeah, they do tend to want to be around people that are more like themselves. And then maybe, you know, I have a grandmother that was in that situation. And then she just said, like, well, I don't want a neighbor in my apartment who's going to have parties on the weekends and be loud at night, you know, all of that type of stuff as well. So, yeah, I mean, we've already seen for decades that co-living works in that sort of similar demographic as well. So it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 to 10 years what types of groups tend to gravitate toward one another or tend to have more conflict. Right. You know, something to keep in mind if we are talking about age here is that all young people take time to mature and to develop their brain fully. Okay. And I'm not kidding about this. Your prefrontal cortex, right up at the front of your skull, your prefrontal cortex, that's the last part to develop. And it does not settle in and finalize the wiring until about age 26. So right now, Gen Z is only up to about age 25. We haven't even seen what Gen Z is going to look like as fully developed adults. Psychologists actually call that period between 18 and 26 now emerging adulthood. So we have childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, and then adulthood. And I don't ever want you to tell a young person, oh, well, your prefrontal cortex hasn't developed yet. Like, pipe down, kiddo, right? No, you don't use that as an argument, but just to understand some of those generational dynamics. That's why every single generation ticked off their parents as teenagers and young adults and made stupid decisions. Let's face it. I mean, we all did something, whether it resulted in a consequence or we got lucky and it didn't. We all did some things during that time that we look back and say, well, that was dumb. You know, I wasn't thinking because I didn't have that fully functioning prefrontal cortex. So a lot of dynamics there with just the immaturity. And then, you know, one of the biggest things I find now is the way people parent is so different. And there's so much judgment. Oh my goodness, right? Well, this parent lets their kid play violent video games, but this parent would never do that. And this parent lets their kid say freaking, right? Give me back my freaking scarf or whatever, you know. And then this parent's like, oh, you don't use that kind of language, right? And this parent lets their kids stay up till 9 or 10. And this parent has them in bed by 7:30 or 8. This parent doesn't let their kid have sugar. You know, everything's got to be sugar-free and we count everything that goes into their bodies. And then the other parents are like, here, have some more chips and a cookie, right? It's just incredible to me how much judgment is out there of just everyday living things, not even generational, not even behavioral styles, right? That's not even introvert, extrovert. It's like just one choice that you make in your lifestyle and other people get so judgy. It's like everybody thinks they're Goldilocks.
Right.
And that anybody who does that more or less than I do, that's ridiculous. Yeah. You give your kid too much sugar or you drive too fast and you don't let your kid have anything good. You make your kid eat all kinds of bland stuff. You should give them a cookie every once in a while, or you drive too slow, right? It's like in every scenario of our lives, we can judge people for being too much or too little or too far or not far enough. Those kind of things. So I think, you know, a critical piece of success is going to be reducing judgment, truly caring about one another. One of our company philosophies is assume positive intent.
Yep.
So always, you know, if something happened, just assume it was a miscommunication or somebody didn't realize what they did or how that came across, or, you know, but if we assume positive intent and then go talk to the person and resolve the conflict rather than she did that on purpose or that driver cut me off, instead of assuming that they did it to you and at you, that type of thing. And that's worked really well for our company culture and just my relationships in my whole life with my sister. Like, she'll tick me off about something and I go, I'm going to guess she didn't realize what she just said. Or I'm going to guess that she didn't mean that in the way that just came across. So I'm going to ask her about that. Let's talk about it. And then sure enough, what's that, Mark?
I think that's a fair assumption. How many people have evil intent behind their actions?
Not very many.
Yep.
Yeah.
I want to test out a hunch really with both of you. I'm thinking, and I agree with you, I think it's mostly going to be progressive people on the liberal side of the spectrum that are drawn to this. There probably will be some libertarian types of people that will be drawn, but mostly it'll be progressives. And I think that the way that boomers are going to connect with certain millennials and Gen Zs is around values, because I think that, for example, being ecologically minded, I think that crosses all of those generations. And really, in many ways, I feel like the younger generation is taking it to a much greater level than we did as millennials, who did a lot of initial drum banging about it, but did not take it across the goal line, pardon the sports metaphor. But I'm thinking that, and racism and sexism, a lot of those values are deeply held and really brought to the forefront for the first time societally by the baby boomers, and the progressive part of millennials and Gen Zs, not so much Gen X, but they're really trying to manifest it in their lives and take it further. So I'm thinking that may be where we connect as generations. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Jess?
Yeah, I of course think values are a point of connection for sure. And Mark, I hear you saying some of these things were started in older generations, but the newer generations are really, really making it happen. So yeah, and then I could see the older generations hopping on like that, that got started and being like, things are getting done. This is great,
Yeah.
So yeah, I absolutely think values would be bringing people together. And of course, again, it just goes back to there's going to be certain types of people that want to live in a co-living situation are going to want that connection to each other. And I think a sense of benefiting for how can we learn from this other person over here? How can we get from that person, and how can we give to that person? I think anyone living in that situation is going to want that, mutual connection and benefits. Yeah. And Cara, I just wanted to say too, the thing that you were saying about the judgment and the assuming good intent, I couldn't agree with you more. The judgment is insane these days. And, it's just, it changes. So judging or not judging, I think could change everything. And assuming good intent was one of the values at the last places I worked too. And it's just such a mindset change. And I do it when, I notice if someone will write me an email and the first thing I'm thinking is like, oh my God, what, this is terrible for me and this and that. And then it's like, you know what? They have stuff going on, and you could always put yourself in the other person's shoes.
Right.
Always. And I do think people have good intentions, or at least to approach things that way. It just makes such a huge difference. I love that you said that.
Yeah. I think that'll be one of the keys. And I agree. I think most of the marketing and recruiting is going to be around your values of these communities, that you want like-minded people, doesn't matter the age, but that you have those foundational similarities of mindset. We actually talk about, you said, the previous generations kind of pushed for more diversity and more acceptance and different things like that. And even the climate and ecological types of conversations and those types of things. The way that I see it is that we had allies. Again, it's like we swing the pendulum, right? So I feel like the boomers were advocates, right? They were the burn the bra, make love, not war. Like they actually did sit-ins and change things. Well, then it kind of swung the other way, and Gen Xers were more allies. Like, okay, yeah, you can be gay, that's fine. And I have gay friends and you go do you, and that's fine, right? But the Gen Xers weren't as much out there fighting for it. It was just, yeah, I support you, I'm not against it, that type of thing. And then you had millennials that took it to the next level of advocates. Like, well, I'm going to go to the Pride Parade with you and be there with you, right? I'm still not gonna like go to the White House or anything, but I'll like be at my local parade with you or put a flag out, that kind of thing. And then now the pendulum has swung all the way back to the boomers of being activists. Now it's Gen Z that is saying, we are marching to Washington. We are going to do this. We're calling the news stations, And so you see Greta Thunberg, you see the Parkland kids from the shooting in Florida, that they got on the news. It wasn't their parents. It was these high schoolers that were saying, I call BS and we want change and all of that stuff. So again, that kind of swings back and forth. And maybe that, Mark, will end up being a connection between the boomers and Gen Z, is that true activism, not just being an ally or even an advocate, which I feel like are kind of the steps, the more subtle support steps, but getting back to some activism around climate change and diversity acceptance and things like that as well. So we'll see where all of that goes, but I definitely think that's the mindset and the value base that is likely to be drawn to more of the co-living spaces moving forward, unless it's marketed as a senior, type of co-living space that is expected to have a more traditional mindset. And there will continue to be some opportunities for that around the country as well, where people want to be around people that are their same age and maybe have a more traditional mindset in that space too.
Yeah, there are what are called lifestyle communities, and you're seeing that with some independent living.
Yes.
That are doing that at the same age. I really see the benefits of having seniors, and we see this not in co-living too, where preschool kids are paired with seniors and do each other a world of good by interacting. So I see this in a way as a throwback to those years, the Waltons, where multiple generations lived under the same roof as families, and see some of the benefits of that. To be able to have a built-in group of childcare assistants, whether it be seniors or other parents with young children, I just think it can be wonderful.
Yeah.
What other as we're starting to sort of wrap up, what are some other pitfalls that you see that could happen with getting these generations together? What are some things to look out for as we prepare?
Yeah. So if I can go back to the judgment conversation, right? We even think about how you load the dishwasher. Everybody has their own perspective on how that should be done and how it's more efficient this way and it's easier that way and those kind of things. And so I hear a lot of people in both work situations and in living situations say, well, I shouldn't have to tell them that. That's just common sense. She should know better. Who raised her? Wolves? right? Like there's that type of judgment where people just think that everyone else should think like they do or see it like they do. So I would encourage everybody to become more self-aware of that. And anytime you think or say, well, that's just common sense. Who doesn't know that? Or I shouldn't have to tell her, or she should know better. Any of those things. I think the key is communicating the expectation that you have, because it's probably unwritten, right? These aren't like in a handbook somewhere, or your move-in guide doesn't say how to load the dishwasher, that type of stuff. But just communicating the expectations right up front. And I do think for the co-living space, you want them, I assume, to create their own culture and environment, but there are probably some general ground rules that need to be addressed with everybody. And they do need a co-living handbook. Like, here's your move-in guide, and here's what's acceptable, here's what's not acceptable, and here's what's expected of you. Because some people may come in laissez-faire, like, oh, yay, it's just everybody gets to do whatever they want. And then someone else is coming in going, great, everyone's going to have roles and responsibilities and help others take care of things. And the other one's like, chill, we don't need to do that. You know what I mean? So there's always got to be some communicated ground rules, some communicated expectations that are typically unwritten, even if it is something like your philosophy, which should include assume positive intent. That in this community, we expect everyone to assume positive intent and, come up with what are those core values. I love that you think, that you have this mindset of values are going to bring people together. So have you identified those? What are they going to be? And if you just put that right out there in the marketing, in the onboarding or move-in, process and whatever, if you put that right out there, there's no question. These are our core values. That's going to draw in the right kind of people. And then it's going to create a place where those people are of a like mindset and, similar mindset. So I would say,
I think since our decision-making hopefully will be by consensus, that's going to really be a challenge for us to keep open minds, and then to use mediation as a conflict resolution tool and formally train those who are interested in doing that. I think that's going to help open people up too. Jess, what are some of your thoughts?
I think as far as the consensus piece, to me, right off the bat, that's something that if consensus is the way decisions are made in some instances, people need to go in just knowing, not necessarily am I going to like the decision or the outcome, but can I sit in a room where consensus is how we decide? And when your choice is not the choice, are you going to be okay with that? And just kind of to think about that ahead of time, because I've been in groups where consensus is how we decide, and I'm good with that. And my attitude and outlook is just like, it's going to be my way or not. And I kind of like the challenge sometimes of learning, like, let things fall where they fall. This isn't just up to me, and I'm going to live with it one way or the other. But again, that's something that people should be aware of going into it. And Cara, like what you were saying about the values and marketing, that's all marketing, and the website, just right, from the start, it's very easy to portray those things. And I think that will attract people who share the same values, and just right away, people could tell. And it's like, companies have culture, places where people live have a culture to them. And then there's the written rules. So it's, in a way, those things are the written rules and simple in a way. You know exactly what you're getting into. And then I think it's easy to illustrate the culture. So you attract the, people that will get along well together and just make it work. If, the people that want to live in co-living too, I think are going to be hopefully up for those challenges.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. If you don't want to live alone, then.
Right. I think it is going to be a challenge that consensus approach doable, but I think it will run up against the entitlement factor that our entire society has, right? So a lot of people said, oh, the millennials are the most entitled ever. Well, yes, that was because personal credit cards came out when we were young, and then our parents got us everything we wanted because they could charge things for the first time. We had parents at Christmas who had credit cards, right? So we not only are the millennials, we were exponentially more entitled than previous generations because of that access. But now think about all ages. We get free delivery in 2, 3, 4 days to our front door, or in an hour, right? If you live in a city that has a service that just brings you your groceries or whatever, you get things delivered to you exactly what you want, when you want it. My son, he not only tells me what show he wants to watch, but which episode of said show. He's like, no, mommy, I want to watch the one with the horse. So we now just have everything at our fingertips. I was joking with my husband the other day about, remember when we were kids and you had to pee and you're like doing the pee-pee dance, but you had to wait for the commercial. And then you would run to the bathroom and then your sibling would go, it's back on. And you're like, forget washing my hands. I gotta go. To get back to it, because if you missed that live show, that was it. You really never got to see it again unless by chance you caught the right rerun later, but it was a long time later, right? So now, just with this whole idea that we have what we want, when we want it as a society, I think we've been more so conditioned to get our way. And I think that will have to be addressed right up front. And I do believe people coming into these kind of communities, hopefully, Jess, you're right. They want to live with other people and they want that. But as soon as they have to sacrifice that they don't get something their way because they were outvoted. Yeah. That'll certainly cause some ripples and whatnot. So I think, I go to a Montessori school, my son does, and it's very progressive. If you're familiar with Montessori, it's a very different type of learning and whatnot. It's actually a charter school in our area, not a private school. But they tell you right up front, Montessori is not for every family. And they don't say child. Mm-hmm. They say it's not for every family, because the parents, like, if you can't handle that they do things differently than a traditional school, do not send your kid there, right? And so I think, putting what those expectations are, and that it is going to be different, and that we are going to be consensus-based decision-making within the co-living space and things like that. As long as you put all that right up front, and maybe even give an example of a difficult decision that had to be made and how the group got through it together, even though not everybody agreed, and, that type of thing. I think that'll be important, because that's what our school does. They don't want to attract everybody and then people go, that is not what I thought it was going to be, and run. They're like, let us tell you, this isn't for everybody. And here's some of the weird things that we do that you may or may not like. And I like about 90% of it. So we love going there, but I don't agree with everything. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me, but okay, you keep doing your thing. So.
Okay. Well, first of all, Cara, I want to thank you for being in the center of this discussion today. And if you would recap just a little bit the nature of your practice. Tell us how people can get in touch with you and what your focus is, and we'll go from there.
Excellent. Yeah. So again, my company is Magnet Culture. You can find us at magnetculture.com, of course, and I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to follow the generational stories and examples and tips and tricks that we tell, as well as reducing employee turnover and conflict in all areas of your life. Everything we teach also typically applies to personal relationships too. So if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, and we have, of course, a YouTube page where we do monthly or about every 6 weeks, we do free webinars on some different topics that you can then download on YouTube. So yeah, please connect with me, reach out. My email is Cara, C-A-R-A, at magnetculture.com if you have any more questions and want to just reach out directly. And Jess, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Mark, thank you so much for your time today and for inviting me to join you.
Great, thank you. And Jess, thanks for being part of this conversation. It really would not have worked otherwise than to have representation, both your point of view, as well as the millennial point of view. So thanks so much for being a part of this. Thanks to both of you, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Hopefully it was a valuable experience for you. It certainly was a rich one for me. So I really appreciate both of you being on. So we're on YouTube. We're on all of your favorite podcast stations. So check us out. For more information about Thrive, go to thrivecolivingcommunities.org, and you can find all of our previous podcasts on the podcast link and sign up for our email notice about those podcasts. So thanks again to the two of you, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. Thanks for joining us for another great episode of the Thrive Co-Living Communities YouTube podcast. To learn more about our mission and how you can support our vision of creating co-living communities worldwide, please visit us at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. To receive advanced viewings of our podcast and other exclusive content, find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Thrive Co-Living Communities. You can also learn more ways to support our mission in the show notes below. Amazon Smile, GoFundMe, Kroger, and our own Thrive Gear store, where you can buy t-shirts, hats, and many other items. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.